From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Now is not the time to be banning refugees, as the Trump administration proposed. It's a time to be embracing people who are victims of terror.
Today, we speak with David Miliband, former British Labour MP, brother of Labour leader Ed Miliband, now head of the International Rescue Committee here in New York. We'll speak with him about the issue that could shut down the U.S. government, immigration.
The reason that refugees have rights around the world is because of extraordinary Western leadership by statesmen and women after the Second World War that became universal rights. Trash the protections of refugees, and we trash our own history.
Rescue, refugees, and the political crisis of our time. Then, on this first anniversary of President Trump's inauguration, we'll speak with a Princeton University professor who faced death threats after calling President Trump a racist months ago.
Donald Trump is really the first president to embrace white supremacy since the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And I think that the implications of that can really be measured or weighed in the weight of the bodies of people who have been killed by open white supremacists and open racists over the last year.
Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor on race and class in the era of Trump, from Black Lives Matter to the white power presidency. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives passed a short-term spending bill Thursday, setting up a high-stakes debate in the Senate ahead of a midnight deadline tonight to reach a deal or face a government shutdown. Congress members voted 230 to 197, mostly along party lines, in favor of Republican-led continuing resolution to fund the government through February 16th. In the Senate, many Democrats have said they'll vote against a bill that fails to protect DACA recipients, undocumented young immigrants who were brought to the United States as children. This is House Speaker Paul Ryan.
Senator Schumer, do not shut down the federal government. Senate Democrats do not oppose anything that is in this bill. They're just holding this critical funding hostage for a deal on a completely unrelated immigration issue. Yes, we need to address the DACA program, and we are engaged in good faith negotiations as we speak. But that deadline is weeks away.
It's not clear whether Senate Democrats will support another stopgap spending bill. Speaking from the Senate floor Thursday, Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer noted this is the fourth continuing resolution, or CR, before Congress in recent months.
There is no promise and no likelihood that another kicking of the can down the road will get something done. We have to sit down together and solve this, with the president or without. Until that happens, no amount of CRs will get this done.
The looming government shutdown came as protesters continue to flood lawmakers' offices on Capitol Hill, demanding passage of a so-called Clean Dream Act that would grant legal status to DACA recipients without concessions for funding for the border wall or enhanced border security. On Thursday, members of the group United We Dream, many of them DACA recipients, chanted "Undocumented and Unafraid" outside the office of Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner. 100 DACA recipients lose their status each day. As the deadline looms tonight, President Trump heads to Mar-a-Lago to play golf and celebrate the first anniversary of his inauguration. In Northern California, immigrant communities are bracing for a crackdown by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement following reports ICE agents are planning raids with the goal of arresting over 1,500 people. The San Francisco Chronicle reports the crackdown will be centered in the Bay Area and that the ICE raids will be the largest yet under President Trump. News of the looming crackdown comes days after the agency's acting director, Thomas Homan, said he would target California after it formally declared itself a sanctuary state for immigrants at the start of the new year. Homan has also said he wants to arrest politicians who resist the Trump administration's immigration policies. On Tuesday, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen told a Senate committee she's looking into charges.
The Department of Justice is reviewing what avenues might be available. The context of this is, of course, not only putting my ICE officers at risk, but also finding an efficient and effective way to enforce our immigration laws.
In Carbondale, Colorado, immigrant rights activists joining nationwide women's marches on Saturday will rally to the defense of Sandra Lopez, an undocumented immigrant mother of 3 who's taken sanctuary with a local church to avoid being deported to Mexico. Lopez is a leader with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. She's fought removal proceedings since she was arrested in 2010 after she says one of her children mistakenly dialed 911. Charges in the case were dropped, but she's faced the prospect of deportation ever since. This is Sandra Lopez speaking recently with Democracy Now! From inside the Unitarian parsonage where she's taken sanctuary with her 2-year-old daughter, Areli.
We need to be organized. We need to leave behind the fear and the shadows and continue raising our voices. There's a quote that divided we fall. We're going to stay strong and united, and we're going to continue defending our dignity and defending sanctuary.
The Trump administration's removed Haitians from eligibility under a pair of U.S. visa programs that offer immigrants a chance to work in low-wage jobs. In a regulatory filing, the Department of Homeland Security said this week Haitians will no longer be allowed to obtain H-2A agricultural and H-2B non-agricultural temporary work permits. In explaining its move, the DHS cited what it called high levels of fraud and abuse committed by Haitians. In November, President Trump ended temporary protected status, or TPS, for nearly 60,000 Haitians, many of whom came to the United States after the devastating 2010 earthquake in Haiti. In Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, demonstrators gathered Thursday outside the U.S. Embassy to protest Trump's policies and to condemn his recent remarks in which he called Haiti, El Salvador, and African nations S-hole countries. This is David Oxygen of the Movement for Liberty and Equality of Haitians.
We're saying that Donald Trump is a racist, criminal president. We're declaring him persona non grata. He can't step foot on this land, the land of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the father of the nation. He shouldn't come to any country in the Caribbean nor any in Africa because he treats those countries like...
The U.S. Supreme Court's frozen a lower court ruling striking down North Carolina's congressional district map as unconstitutional. The High Court's 7-2 ruling was submitted without explanation, with Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg dissenting. Last week's lower court ruling marked the first time a federal court has struck down a congressional map because of political gerrymandering. Thursday's freeze by the Supreme Court is likely to keep in place North Carolina's long, winding, and oddly shaped congressional districts through November's midterm elections in a delay that'll likely benefit Republicans. New data from NASA and the United Nations show 2017 was among the hottest years in recorded history, second only to 2016, as global carbon dioxide levels soared to a new record level and global surface temperatures rose by 2 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. This is Omar Badur, senior scientist with the World Meteorological Organization.
Today we can announce that 2017 year is equally second warmest along with 2015. And we can also say that is part of the 3 warmest years on record. The 3 warmest years on record are namely 2015, 2016, and 2017.
2017's near-record heat came without El Niño weather patterns that historically drive global temperatures higher, suggesting human activity has dwarfed natural variability as the largest driver of climate change. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has announced U.S. troops will remain indefinitely in Syria.
But let us be clear. The United States will maintain a military presence in Syria, focused on ensuring ISIS cannot reemerge.
Tillerson said the troops are needed to counter the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Iranian influence. This comes as the monitoring group Air Wars has revealed as many as 6,100 civilians were killed in U.S.-backed airstrikes in Syria and Iraq last year, 3 times higher than the previous year. Meanwhile, tensions rising on the northern border of Syria as Turkey's preparing for what looks like an assault in the Kurdish enclave of Afrin. The Trump administration acknowledged Thursday it's withholding $45 million in emergency food aid pledged to Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. This is State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert speaking Thursday.
That was something that we had planned to make a contribution in early 2018 for that $45 million for the West Bank Gaza emergency appeal, and that was simply for food aid. We routinely provide them with that type of forecasting. At the time, though, when we provided that note, that information to UNRWA, we made it clear that it was a pledge, it was not a guarantee, and that it would need to be confirmed later.
The move to withhold food aid came as the Trump administration cut off a further $65 million in annual U.S. funding for UNRWA. That's the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Meanwhile, the Trump administration said Thursday it would relocate its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by the end of the year, a move condemned by Palestinians who say negotiations over the final status of the city are critical to any future peace agreement. In Egypt, media activists have launched a new archive holding hundreds of hours of footage shot and collected around the 2011 revolution that toppled longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak. The archive, named 858, an archive of resistance, was compiled by the Egyptian media collective Mosireen and is accessible online at 858.ma. Back in the United States, President Trump's appointee to the federal agency that runs AmeriCorps and other service programs has resigned after CNN aired a series of comments he made disparaging women, Muslims, blacks, immigrants, gays, lesbians, and trans people. Carl Higbee is heard in remarks to radio shows as recently as 2016 saying black people suffer from lax morality and that they think that breeding is a form of employment. Higbee is also heard saying U.S. citizens should have the right to shoot migrants in the face at the U.S.-Mexico border. Higbee led the pro-Trump Great America PAC and served as a surrogate for then-candidate Donald Trump in 2016 when he defended Trump's proposed registry of Muslims by citing World War II Japanese-American internment camps as a positive thing. The Trump administration cleared the way Thursday for healthcare workers to refuse to provide services, including abortions, gender-affirming surgery, and contraception, that run counter to their stated moral or religious convictions. This is Roger Severino, head of the newly formed Office of Civil Rights inside the Health and Human Services Department.
And we are saying with the launch of this new division that you do not need to shed your religious identity, you do not need to shed your moral convictions to be part of the public square. Everyone is entitled to an equal seat.
NARAL Pro-Choice America blasted the move, tweeting, quote, "Despite the name, this division isn't actually here to enforce religious freedom. It's designed to protect providers who discriminate against women and LGBTQ people." The new department is supposedly called the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division. That's of the HHS. Women employees of the United Nations say the organization is rife with sexual harassment and assault, with accusers largely ignored and perpetrators free to act with impunity. The Guardian interviewed dozens of current and former United Nations employees who described a worldwide culture of silence across the UN and a grievance system that's stacked against victims. Meanwhile, former colleagues of Los Angeles Times CEO Ross Levinson have accused the newspaper's executive of creating a frat house environment rife with sexual harassment. NPR reports Levinson has been a defendant in 2 sexual harassment lawsuits and is known for publicly ranking the so-called hotness of female co-workers. The report comes as the LA Times focuses much of its coverage on the growing Me Too movement and the Time's Up campaign against sexual abuse in Hollywood. And Paul Booth, longtime labor leader and anti-war activist, has died at the age of 74. In 1965, Booth helped lead the first major march against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. Through much of the 60s, Paul Booth was a spokesperson for Students for a Democratic Society, the campus-based civil rights and anti-war group. Booth went on to organize on behalf of working people for more than 4 decades with AFSCME, the country's largest public employees union. Paul Booth died Wednesday of complications from leukemia in Washington, D.C. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives passed a short-term spending bill late Thursday, setting up a high-stakes showdown in the Senate today, ahead of a midnight deadline to reach a deal or face government shutdown. Congress members voted 230 to 197, mostly along party lines, in favor of a Republican-led continuing resolution to fund the government through February 16th. In the Senate, many Democrats have said they'll vote against a bill that fails to protect young dreamers, DACA recipients, undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children. This is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
They want a sensible compromise on immigration. 2 years ago, we voted to fund the government through February 16th. In the Senate, many Democrats have said they'll vote against a bill that fails to protect young dreamers, DACA recipients, undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children. This is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
They want a sensible compromise
But they cannot, Madam President, for the life of them, understand why some senators would hold the entire country hostage until we arrive at a solution to a problem that doesn't fully materialize until March. Military families, veterans, and children benefiting from the S-chip program don't need to be shoved aside. Don't need to be shoved aside while we continue good faith negotiations.
100 DACA recipients lose their status every day, while the debate over immigration could force a U.S. government shutdown. Our next guest argues migrants and refugees are a key political crisis worldwide. United Nations Refugee Agency's most recent annual report says the number of displaced people worldwide has hit a record high, with more than 65 million people forcibly displaced from their homes across the globe. That's 20 people forced to flee their homes every single minute. These refugees often face deadly journeys to reach safety. Last week, humanitarian groups said dozens of refugees drowned when their boats sank off the coast of Libya en route to Europe. This week, the Arizona humanitarian group No More Deaths accused U.S. Border Patrol agents of routinely sabotaging or confiscating humanitarian aid left by activists near the border with Mexico, condemning some Mexican and Central American refugees to die of exposure or dehydration in the Sonoran Desert. As the humanitarian crisis grows, many nations, particularly the United States, are limiting immigration, closing their borders. During his first year in office, President Trump sought to ban all refugees and citizens of mainly majority Muslim nations. When federal judges struck down multiple versions of the so-called Muslim travel bans, Trump then slashed the number of refugees who could be resettled in the United States this year, capping the number at 45,000, the lowest level in 3 decades. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's also cut $65 million in annual contributions to the UN Palestinian refugee agency known as UNRWA. On Thursday, Pope Francis made an urgent appeal on behalf of refugees and migrants while speaking on the last day of his visit to Chile.
We know well that there is no Christian joy when doors are closed. There is no Christian joy when others are made to feel unwanted, when there is no room for them in our midst. We must be alert that work is becoming more precarious, which destroys lives and homes. We must be alert to those that take advantage of the irregularity of many immigrants because they don't understand the language or they don't have their papers. We must be alert to the lack of housing, land, and work of so many families.
Well, for more, we're joined by David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, former British Labour MP, brother of Labour leader Ed Miliband. His new book is titled Rescue: Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So you have heard, David, all of the headlines. Half of them involve immigrants, involve refugees, involve people taking sanctuary across the country, California declaring itself a sanctuary state, and Trump administration officials threatening to arrest not only refugees, but politicians who defy Trump administration policy. This is the anniversary of President Trump's inauguration. What is your assessment of his approach to immigrants in this country?
Well, issues of refugees and immigration have always been matters of politics as well as policy, and there's a lot of confusion. One of the points in my book is that a refugee is someone who flees their home as a result of conflict or persecution. An economic migrant is someone who's seeking a better life. It's not that one is good and the other is bad, but they're different. And I think the way I would summarize the approach of the Trump administration is really a reversal of the best of American history. It's not that throughout the ages America has always made itself open to refugees and immigrants from around the world, because there have been dark periods of American history. But the best of the American approach, both in respect of immigration and in respect of refugees, and we should talk about the difference between them, but the best of American history has established this country as a haven for those who are seeking not just a place of safety from persecution, but also a chance to start a new life and contribute to the society that they are arriving in. And what the president has done, you referred, just to give you one example, to the fact that the president has halved the number of refugees who should be allowed to come to the US from the 90,000 a year that have been allowed since the 1980s, since Ronald Reagan's time, to just 45,000. But actually the truth is that the administration that is putting that into practice is not delivering 45,000 refugees this year. It's going to deliver about 20,000. So you've actually seeing, because of the actions of the Department of Homeland Security, a quartering of America's historic commitment to refugees at a time when there are record numbers of refugees around the world. And this is significant both for those individual cases and for the lesson it sets elsewhere in the world, because the truth is a country like America has 1% of the world's refugees. Countries like Ethiopia, Pakistan, Lebanon, Jordan, they have the most refugees in the world. And I think that there's an issue of substance, but also an issue of symbolism at stake here.
I want to step back for a minute. Why you care so much about the issue of migrants, of refugees, of immigrants. Talk about your own family background.
Yeah, I mean, maybe people have an image of a refugee that doesn't summon up someone with a blue shirt and a red tie on, but speaking with a British accent. But I was born in safety in the UK in 1965, but both my parents were refugees. From my dad from Belgium, from Nazi-occupied Belgium in 1940. My mum survived the war in Poland, came to the UK as a refugee in 1946. So I don't want to exaggerate the sense in which today's crisis is a parallel of previous crises, but there are very similar issues. And the most fundamental issue is whether those who are not persecuted have a duty to those who are. I call it the duty to strangers. And it seems to me that the best lessons of human history are that when the duty to strangers is exhibited, it builds not just a more moral planet, but also a safer planet. And what we're seeing today, ironically, in a world that's more connected than ever before, is that it's a world that's, the danger is it's defined by walls, not by connections. And I think that goes to the heart of the political crisis as well as the policy crisis that exists at the moment.
How would you characterize President Trump's policies? I mean, you were born in Britain, but you now work here in New York.
Yeah, I live and
head
work. I mean, people don't know this, but the International Rescue Committee was founded by Albert Einstein, one of the most famous refugees in this city, never mind this country, in some ways an emblem of what refugees can bring. So I now lived and worked in the US over the last 4 years. And I think that global leadership has been abandoned, or in Richard House's words, abdicated. The sense that America established itself not with a high moral tone, but with a set of principles and values that would be enshrined not just constitutionally and legally, but also in policies, that has been abandoned. And I think that the question facing the country is whether or not that is going to be consolidated in the next 3 years, or whether it can be reversed. Because the truth is that if you carry on reducing the number of refugees who are allowed here at the current rate, if plans to reduce the international aid budget are followed through, then there'll be a double whammy, really, on the world's most vulnerable people.
On Capitol Hill, a slew of lawmakers have joined members of the Congressional Black Caucus in backing a resolution to censure President Trump over his racist comments in which he reportedly called African nations, El Salvador, Haiti, S-hole countries, but he said the curse. Several Democratic lawmakers have announced they'll also skip the State of the Union address on January 30th over Trump's racist remarks. Can you talk about what he said? It's not only calling people from these countries, Botswana recently asked for a clarification. They want to know if they're in the S-hole category, but using that word, but also saying we want more immigrants from Norway.
Well, I think that the way I would put it is that really the presidency has been dragged into the gutter by not just the language, but the thinking behind it. Because, as you say, Botswana, every African country is asking, well, does that include us? I mean, it's true that the countries that produce the most refugees are war-torn. They are conflict-ridden. But some of them are caught in conflict as a result of a resource curse, not a poverty curse. If you think about a place like the Democratic Republic of Congo, in some parts of its history, the undemocratic Republic of Congo, the conflict there is because of the resources that exist in that country, not because of the poverty that exists in that country, the conflict over mineral resources. And I think it's really important that the people were condemned as well as the country, and that's the most pernicious aspect of what was said. My point would be that this has a domino effect around the world. When the Jordanian government is hosting 650,000 refugees, when the Lebanese government is hosting 1 million refugees, when the Kenyan government has 1 million Somalis, the worst forces in those countries are going to be citing President Trump in their defense. And I think that there is a profound question both about how the country governs itself internally, but also what sort of role it wants to play externally. One interesting thing about the Trump administration is both its domestic and its international agenda come together on this issue.
One of the things that we recently played just at the top of the show, your clips about the conflict of the defining of refugees as terrorists, and your point that, in fact, it's the opposite.
No, these are people who are fleeing terror. I mean, you cited Syria in your introduction. People should know the war in Syria isn't over, but it's being prosecuted not primarily by the American government, but by the Syrian government. 200,000 Syrians in the northwest of the country have been driven from their homes by a bombing campaign in the last 6 or 7 weeks. And so these are people who are the victims of terror. Some of them get good press coverage. Some of them, the coverage of the appalling stories of Yazidi women being chased from their homes by ISIS, they get a sympathetic ear. Others get a less sympathetic one. But my point is simple. People who've known the price and the cost of terror, they become the most patriotic and productive citizens when they find refuge here. And I think there's one other point that's important as well. America is making a small commitment to resettlement. The great bulk of refugees stay in countries close to those at war, and that doesn't include the U.S., notwithstanding what's happening south of the border in the northern triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. People are fleeing gang violence there. We shouldn't forget that. But one of the most pernicious parts of the Trump narrative, President Trump's narrative, is that somehow America is bearing an undue burden of the world's problems. That isn't the case when it comes to humanitarian and refugee issues.
Can you talk about President Trump shutting off funding, something like $65 million, to UNRWA, to the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, and the significance of this, what this means for Palestinians?
And obviously, the Palestinian population is the longest-standing refugee population. It was only after the Second World War that the refugees were given any rights in international law. After the foundation of the State of Israel, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, elsewhere in the Middle East, UNRWA, including in Gaza, UNRWA, the United Nations agency, provides above all for children. It's above all providing support through education for kids. The $65 million, you're right, that's been granted is the first part of a 3-part delivery of American aid to support this organization. And it seems to me very important that we don't lose sight of the people on the receiving end of this. You have 1.8 million people in Gaza, half of them are children. You've got Palestinian refugees elsewhere in the region. And the message that's being sent is a rejection to them and their condition. And it seems to me it goes to the heart of what the country should be standing for. And at a time when the UN is needed more than ever before, the last thing that the UN needs is one of its most effective programs to have the rug pulled from under it.
I wanted to go to a Gaza resident. They're saying that soon they could starve unless international donors step up to fill the funding gap left by President Trump.
We will be lost. It will be a catastrophe. People will be stealing from each other. We will live in a catastrophe. We will suffer to provide food and wheat. People will kill each other.
What should I do? Should I go sell one of my kids or sell my kidney? What should I do? Should I go and steal or work as a spy? I need cooking oil, yogurt, eggs, and bread.
Cairo, the Arab League met Wednesday for a 2-day conference where leaders condemned the Trump administration for cutting funding to UNRWA and for recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. David Miliband.
Yeah, the crisis in Gaza is a subset of the wider Middle Eastern crisis, the wider crisis of what's called the peace process, but there is no peace process in respect of the Palestinian issue at the moment. I was in Gaza in 2012 before I started this job. I went to visit, and the fact that half the population is under the age of 18 is ignored in so much of the coverage. This is a very tightly confined area. I think that there are mechanisms in place to make sure that people don't starve, but that doesn't mean that there isn't grave need there. And also, frankly, grave danger of radicalization, because for the first time there are now reports of ISIS organizing in Gaza, and the equation between immiseration and extremism is well documented. And so both for moral reasons and for strategic reasons, I think this is a misbegotten policy.
Talk about what you think is the solution to the refugee crisis.
Good. I'm glad to get a chance at that, because it's easy to spend all the time thinking 65 million people displaced by conflict and persecution. They're displaced for an average of 10 years. Half of them are in urban areas. And one could almost think that there's just endless suffering and no solutions. In my book, I point out that in addition to the refugee resettlement issue for the most vulnerable cases, three things are absolutely key for refugee populations. First, since half of them are kids, half of refugees are kids, education needs to come center stage. Traditionally, in the humanitarian sector, education has been seen as a luxury. It gets only 2% of global humanitarian funding. Actually, education is a lifeline, not a luxury, for refugee children. Secondly, refugees need to be allowed to work. 60% are in urban areas. For the adults, they need the chance to contribute to the societies that they are living in. The countries that are hosting them, though, like Lebanon, Jordan, Kenya, they need international economic support, and organizations like the World Bank need to step up. Thirdly, the traditional image of a refugee is someone who's been given a tent or a fleece or food. The thing that refugees need more than anything else is cash. They need the ability to participate in the local market economy that they are living in. And some of our work at the International Rescue Committee shows that if you empower refugees, you also bring benefit to the local host community. Because, of course, in the countries that are hosting refugees, the local population is under enormous stress as well. There are towns and cities across the Middle East, across Africa, whose population doubles as a result of a refugee influx. Uganda, a country with only $1,000 per income per head per person, has received 1 million refugees in the last year. You wouldn't know that. They're not building a wall, but they need support to help encourage those people to be able to contribute to the Ugandan economy. And it seems to me that if you take seriously the education, the employment, the cash support, you can redesign the humanitarian aid system so that instead of simply helping people survive from one year to the next, it's actually giving them the chance to lead a dignified life.
So the issues that you raised, you talked earlier about so many refugees come from war-torn countries.
Well, almost by definition, all of them do. I mean, there's a small number who are persecuted for political reasons, but the vast bulk of the refugee flow is because of wars in Syria or Somalia or South Sudan.
So what about those who vote for war? For example, you were a politician before you were head of the International Rescue Committee, Labour parliamentarian, MP in Britain. Didn't you vote to authorize the war in Iraq?
I did, and the story of Iraq is a terrible tale. In a phrase, the war was won, but the peace was lost. There were no weapons of mass destruction. I document and I speak very openly about this in the book without any reservation. But I think that it's important to understand that the crisis of diplomacy that exists at the moment is real. You know that the Trump administration is proposing to cut 30% from the State Department. What did I spend my time doing as foreign minister? I spent my time preventing a war in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia. I spent my time trying to stop the slaughter in Sri Lanka, where Tamil residents were caught in the north of the Jaffna Peninsula. There's a crisis of peacemaking that stands at the root of the refugee crisis today. And it seems to me that it's that we need to speak to in a very thoroughgoing way.
If you could cast that vote again.
Of course I wouldn't cast it in the same way. I've said that very publicly and very clearly.
Right, so talk about that. Talk about what led you to do it and what was the new information you have, what you realize now, and what advice you have to politicians today who are making decisions in these areas.
Well, these are hard decisions. In 2003, the main issue for the UK Parliament was that there were significant levels of undocumented weapons of mass destruction that the Saddam regime had built up since 1991. Hans Blix, the UN inspector, produced a 175-page report documenting the way in which the Saddam Hussein's regime had failed to dispose of the weapons of mass destruction that had been developed after 1991. Everyone thought they were there. It turned out they weren't there. So the heart of the mistake was in respect of that criteria. I think there's a wider point too, though, which is that the war in Afghanistan was not over in 2003, and it's still not over today. And it seems to me that there has been a real political failure, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, in developing institutions that are credible and legitimate institutions for the sharing of political power. And the biggest lesson I draw from the last 20 years is that countries that establish legitimate and credible systems for sharing political power, even in a fragile context, so Lebanon would be a good example. Every Lebanese community has a stake in the government. There's not been a census since 1931. It's a very fragile country, but every community has a stake in power, and the country hasn't been at civil war since 1990. The countries that don't establish credible institutions for sharing power, Afghanistan, Iraq, those are the ones that fall into failed states.
But would you say that the greatest driver of the refugee crisis, these wars, the longest war in U.S. history, Afghanistan and Iraq, are really what broke the Middle East?
Well, I think that you'd say that there are two things. One, the war in Iraq is certainly part of that, but the drive of Middle Eastern populations, of Arab populations, for accountable government, for decent levels of freedom, those have been the impulses that have propelled Arab youth onto the streets, not just in the Arab Spring, but before, and not just Arab youth. In 2000, just to take the Syrian example, there's obviously been a civil war in Syria since 2001. It started in 2011. It started with a boy in Daraa being persecuted and tortured by his own government. But in 2005, 250 Syrian intellectuals were demanding accountable government. And I think that there's a danger in thinking all of this comes from Western policy. Don't ignore the people on the receiving end. And the truth about significant parts of the Arab world is the absence of accountable government, the absence of opportunities for women, the absence of opportunities for young people. Remember, 60% of the Arab world is under the age of 30. It's the lack of those opportunities that is driving the challenge to government authorities in the region. And you've seen that most recently, remarkably, in Iran.
Would you describe President Trump as racist and
Well, I think that the racist statements have been very clear. And I think that the most important thing now is that the voice of America is not simply the voice of President Trump, it's the voice of the millions of people who listen to your show, because around the world, there's a poll that's out today, America's reputation has never been lower. I'm not an American, I'm a British citizen, but I live and work here, as you said. And there's a side of America that's being lost, and that side is the side that when a refugee comes into a community, we resettle refugees across America in 26 cities. When refugees arrive in Dallas or in Houston or in San Diego, the American reaction is actually not to spurn them, it's not to build a wall between them and their new neighbor, it's actually to knock on the door and say, where are you from? How can I help you? Do you know the way the local schools work? Do you know the way the local health system works? We want to help you. And I think that side of America needs to be heard, because at the moment the world is seeing another side.
David Miliband, I want to thank you so much for being with us. President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, former British Labour MP, former British Foreign Secretary. His new book is Rescue: Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, Keeanga Yamata-Taylor will be talking to us about what she describes as the white power presidency. When she first called President Trump a racist months ago in a speech at Mount Holyoke, she got death threats. She continues her charges. Stay with you. Stay with us.
Saw you at the farm, picture on a closed circuit. Boy, you lost it all, thinking you could rework it. Stole a credit card and ran away. Back in Louisville, they call the play, and now we'll all rewind and just listen for the lies of summer. We'll all rewind and just listen for the lies of summer. Who gets hurt the most? The guys that you would call brother, the girls that loved a ghost that had a sick mother. Now you're waiting for the mess to take, but it takes a miracle to heal this break. And now we'll all rewind and just listen for the lies of summer.
Lies of Summer, Amy Mann, here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As President Trump completes his first year in office, activists in cities across the country will hold mass protests Saturday on the first anniversary of the historic Women's March. This comes as a slew of lawmakers have joined members of the Black Congressional Caucus in backing a resolution to censure President Trump over his racist comments in which the president reportedly used an expletive to refer to African nations El Salvador and Haiti. Several Democratic lawmakers say they'll also skip the State of the Union address January 30th over Trump's racist remarks, calling countries like Haiti, Salvador, and the continent of Africa S-holes. Meanwhile, Trump himself denies being a racist, claiming on Sunday he is, quote, the least racist person.
No, I'm not a racist. I am the least racist person you have ever interviewed. That I can tell you.
That was President Trump speaking to reporters Sunday. Yet over the last year, Trump has repeatedly faced national and international condemnation over his comments and actions. Trump has tried several times to ban citizens of some majority Muslim nations from entering the U.S., executive orders that many have called Muslim bans. The president refused to condemn the deadly white supremacist violence in Charlottesville, Virginia in August, in which Ku Klux Klan members and other far-right extremists attack anti-racist counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer. Instead, Trump blamed both sides for the attacks and claimed there were, quote, very fine people among the white nationalists. Trump has repeatedly attacked African-American NFL players who take the knee during the national anthem before games to protest racial injustice and police brutality. And Trump has endorsed and campaigned for the racist, xenophobic, homophobic Alabama Republican Senate candidate, the pedophile Roy Moore, who was defeated in large part by black women voters. Trump pardoned the notorious racist former Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who's now declared he's running for U.S. Senate in Arizona. He's repeatedly retweeted white nationalists. And Trump has also repeatedly insulted Native Americans, including attempting to use Pocahontas as a racial slur to insult Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who says her family is part Cherokee. Among the times Trump tried to use Pocahontas' name as a racial slur was during a White House ceremony honoring Navajo code talkers, Native Americans who served in the Marines during World War II and used the Navajo language in order to transmit encoded information. Trump and his Justice Department, led by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, have also pushed policies that seek to roll back years of civil rights gains, including limiting federal oversight of police departments with a history of civil rights violations and ramping up the war on drugs. Well, the list goes on. To discuss Trump's first year in office, where racial justice movements go from here as well, we're joined by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Assistant Professor of African-American Studies at Princeton University, author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and editor of a new collection of essays that is titled How We Get Free: Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thanks, Amy. Very glad to be here.
We had you on 1 year ago, almost exactly. We were in Washington, D.C. We were broadcasting from public television, WHUT's studios at the historically black College of Howard University. A few months later, you would speak at Hampshire College.
Correct.
And tell us what you said and what happened next.
Well, I gave a commencement speech at Hampshire in which, you know, it was a 19-minute speech, and to kind of set the context for where the students were and what they were, the world that they were going into. I talked about Trump for probably all of 30 seconds. But I said what I thought to be true, that the world that they were graduating into was very dangerous, and one of the main factors in that was because the President of the United States, Donald Trump, was a racist, sexist megalomaniac. Today, especially given the list of examples that you just went through, it seems ludicrous that I would be attacked by Fox News, receive hate mail, death threats for making what is so clear and to me such an obvious statement. And I think that you know, the fallout from that with the right was kind of a prelude to an attack on academics, attack on radicals for really saying the truth about the nature of this administration.
You have talked about President Trump, white supremacy, and the precedent set by this president going back to Woodrow Wilson. Interesting, because you teach at Princeton University, where the Woodrow Wilson School is. Can you talk more about that?
Well, I think that it's clear. I mean, there's a parsing of Trump's words in the mainstream media to determine is Trump a racist, or does he just make racist statements? And
or I think they say, does he make racial statements?
Yes, correct. And I think it shows how the discussion around what is racism in the United States has deteriorated, so that unless someone is declaring I am a racist or burning a cross, that everyone is loath or reluctant to identify what is painfully obvious. And so I think that the Trump administration's embrace of white supremacy is naked and it's obvious. But I also think that we have to understand what the impetus for that is, because rarely in American history, especially when we're talking about elected officials and the political establishment, is there racism just purely for the sake of racism? Is it that it's just driven solely by vitriol? And so I think that we have to understand the racism of Donald Trump and the sort of alt-right racism of the Republican Party in general, in combination with their naked money grab, with the smash and grab operation of the tax cuts, of the efforts to really radically redistribute wealth from the bottom to the top, that they have set out on a course to basically explain away the conditions of and what I think is legitimate economic anxiety of ordinary white people, and say that it's the Muslim, it's the Mexican, and it's the blacks. And now we can add to that, it's the the countries of Africa, Haiti, El Salvador, who want to send their supposed refuse to our country. That is the reason why you are in the insecure condition that you are. So I think that we have to see those two things as linked, which is not to diminish the impact that racism has in this country. Because, as I said earlier, that the weight of the impact of the open embrace of white supremacy in this administration can be literally weighed and measured in the weight of the bodies of the people who have been killed by white supremacists in this country. I think there was a report out earlier this week that said white supremacists who have deaths by white supremacists account for the largest number of deaths of so-called extreme groups in this country. And so there is an impact that is being made by that has to be accounted for.
You talk about, in the beginning of your book, How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, you talk about, in the days after the disastrous 2016 presidential election, I'm quoting you, a popular meme showing 94% of black women voters had cast their ballot for Hillary Clinton was circulated as proof that black women had done their part to keep Trump out of the White House. Take it from there.
Well, I think that was part of the narrative, but that black women bore no responsibility for the Trump administration, which is obviously true. But I think that there was a larger story in there that really has been missed by a lot of the efforts to assign blame for the electoral rise of Trump. And for me, the more interesting part of the election was that 100 million people did not vote, that there are almost 240 eligible voters, 240 million eligible voters in the United States, and almost 100 million people did not participate in an election that was discussed as the most consequential of our lifetime. And for me, the question was, what does that say about our political system? And so I think that discussion got missed in talking about the level of electoral support for Hillary Clinton by black women, by also not looking at how the numbers of black women who participate in the election was actually down from 2012, the Obama election, which brought out historic numbers of people. And so I think that understanding that 100 million people didn't participate in the election is really critical to this ongoing debate about the state of the Democratic Party and whether or not the party is actually in a position to pose an alternative, a credible alternative to the Republicans in 2018 in the looming 2020 election. And we cannot have a serious discussion about that without talking about the 100 million people who did not vote in the last election.
What about this Quinnipiac poll that has just come out, talking about the overwhelming percentage of African Americans supporting Bernie Sanders?
Well, I think that hopefully it begins to shift the very narrow discussion that the Sanders phenomenon is driven solely by the quote-unquote Bernie bros, that African Americans are not interested in socialism, African Americans are not interested in Bernie Sanders. In fact, this poll showed that Sanders had the highest favorability rating among African Americans by a country mile compared to white people. I think it was 43% of whites had a favorable view of Bernie Sanders compared to 70% of African Americans and 55% of Latinos. And I don't think that this is a complicated question. Why is that? Because I think most people understand, black people understand, that if Sanders' program, the things that Bernie Sanders advocated and argued for, the redistribution of wealth from the top to the bottom, universal health care, a living wage, so on and so forth, the redistribution of resources from the criminal justice system to the war machine, to public services and public institutions, that would have an immediate impact in the lives of black people and in black communities, immediate positive impact. And people know that. And so I think that these are the kinds of facts and information that have to be wedded into the debate about what direction for the Democratic Party, because we also know from the Democratic Party establishment that there's a war against the Sanders influence within the party. There was a purge of Sanders supporters within the Democratic National Committee. And so there is going to be a reckoning in that party about what their actual direction is. And I think for progressives, for the left, and certainly for radicals, that the ease with which people cave into the decision to back various Democratic Party leaders, take off or Democratic Party candidates, remove the pressure that is necessary to force that party to actually pay attention to the agenda of ordinary people from below. And that's a calculus that has to shift in the coming elections.
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. Keeanga-Yamahtta-Taylor, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, editor of a new collection of essays titled How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. This is Democracy Now! Back with her in a moment.
See how the rain falls on the tree where he hung. It falls on the farmer who tied the noose, and on the grave where the last hymn was sung. See how the rain falls without a sound. It falls on the farmer who locks the barn door. It falls on the churchyard ground. The farmer smiles as as he looks at
See How the Rain Falls by Julius Lester, the African-American author, activist, musician who died this week at the age of 79. For many years, Lester hosted Uncle Tom's Cabin on Pacifica radio station WBAI in New York. In 1964, he risked his life to join civil rights activists fighting Jim Crow laws and segregation in the South as part of Mississippi's Summer Project. Julius Lester went on to serve as photographer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and was a longtime professor of African-American studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our conversation with our guest, Keeanga Yamata-Taylor, assistant professor of African-American studies at Princeton University, out with a new book, How We Get Free. I'm sorry because I had the sense from your sigh, Keeanga, you just heard that Julius Lester died.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to break that to you.
It's terrible, terrible news.
How We Get Free, your book. If you could talk about who the Combahee River Collective is, and we'll do a post-show after this because we have to go longer than we have time for. But the whole issue of this radical women's collective really coining the term identity politics, taking on the issue of intersectionality, and this was 40 years ago.
So the Combahee River Collective was a group of black radical feminists that formed in 1974 that considered themselves to be a left split from a organization called the National Black Feminist Organization, which I think they would characterize as certainly to the left of mainstream white feminism, feminist organizations, but still not far enough to the left in terms of the Combahee's focus on linking women's oppression to capitalism and linking the black women's oppression to capitalism, but also more importantly, I think, or of equal importance, is seeing that the liberation of black women was connected to a radical reconstruction of American society. And so the group formed in 1974 and really was active around issues of abortion rights, reproductive freedom, including campaigning against sterilization, taking up the struggle against domestic violence and against violence against women. They were based in Boston, and during this time there was really a spate of violent attacks against black women. Black women were being killed in cases that were going unresolved. And this really shaped the political world that they were active in. In 1977, they produced a document that is really foundational in the politics of radical black feminism, called the Combahee River Collective Statement, which really both theorized aspects of black women's oppression, but also connected that to strategies that they believed would be central to ending it, both in terms of how to link the struggles that black women faced to the struggles of other oppressed people, which they called coalition building, but also the need to have transformative, revolutionary, radical politics. And so I think that, this is the 40th anniversary, or last year, 2017, was the 40th anniversary of the publication of the statement. And part of my motivation for doing this book, which is a republication of the statement itself, and interviews with the three authors of the statement, was to really try to introduce both the politics and the practice and really the lives and experiences of these women to a new generation of activists.
We just have 20 seconds, but what would you say their message is to them today?
I think their message for them today is that it's not enough just to identify the ways that black women are oppressed, but that it is important to synthesize that analysis with a plan of action. It is important to act because that is the only way that black women will get free.
I want to thank you so much for being with us, and we're going to do part 2 of this discussion, posted online at democracynow.org. We'll be broadcasting from the Sundance Film Festival following the documentary track all week next week. Kianga Yamata-Taylor, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, her new book, How We Get Free. I'm Amy Goodman. Happy birthday, Edith Penty. Thanks.